Madison Williams never imagined she'd be sitting in a lawyer's office at 24, listening to a stranger dictate the terms of living in her own childhood home. But there she was, watching her father's secretary, now girlfriend, Veronica Sterling, flip through legal documents with the confidence of someone who'd already won a war Madison didn't even know was being fought. The property taxes alone are astronomical, Veronica said, her perfectly manicured nails tapping against the mahogany table. If Madison wants to continue living there, she needs to contribute. It's only fair. Madison's father, Robert Williams, sat silent in the corner, his eyes focused anywhere but on his daughter's face. The man who once carried her on his shoulders through the same house they were now discussing had become a stranger, and Madison was about to discover just how deep that transformation ran. This is the story of how Madison Williams fought to reclaim not just her inheritance, but her identity, her family's legacy, and her own sense of worth, one battle at a time.
Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from, and if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow I've saved something extra special for you. The Williams family estate on Maple Ridge Drive had always been Madison's sanctuary. Growing up, she'd spent countless afternoons in the sprawling garden, helping her mother, Helen, tend to the prize-winning rose bushes that lined the wraparound porch. The 3-story Victorian home, with its intricate woodwork and stained glass windows, had been in the Williams family for 4 generations. It was more than just a house. It was a living testament to their family's history in Millbrook, Connecticut. Madison's childhood had been picture-perfect in many ways. Her father, Robert, owned Williams & Associates, a successful accounting firm that served most of the town's established families. Her mother, Helen, had been a beloved elementary school teacher who somehow managed to make every student feel special while maintaining the warmest home Madison had ever known. Family dinners were sacred. Sunday mornings meant pancakes and classical music, and holidays transformed their home into something magical. But that idyllic world began to crumble 3 years ago when Helen was diagnosed with pancreatic cancer. Madison, who had just started her master's program in art therapy at Yale, watched helplessly as her mother's vibrant spirit slowly faded. The woman who had once filled their home with laughter and warmth became a fragile shadow of herself, spending her final months in the very bedroom where Madison had been born. During those difficult months, Veronica Sterling had been a constant presence at Williams & Associates. She'd started as a temporary secretary when Robert's longtime assistant retired, but her efficiency and attention to detail quickly made her indispensable. Veronica was 38, impeccably dressed, and possessed a sharp intelligence that helped streamline Robert's chaotic filing system. She worked late hours, handled difficult clients with ease, and gradually became Robert's right hand in managing both his business and personal affairs. Madison had been grateful for Veronica's help initially. With her mother's medical appointments and her own academic responsibilities, she couldn't be there to support her father the way she wanted. Veronica stepped into that gap seamlessly, coordinating with doctors, managing insurance paperwork, and ensuring Robert ate regular meals during the most stressful period of his life. Helen Williams passed away on a rainy Tuesday morning in October, 2 years ago. Madison had been holding her mother's hand when she drew her final breath, and in that moment, she felt not just the loss of her mother, but the end of the family she'd always known. The house suddenly felt too large and too quiet, filled with memories that seemed to echo in every room. The months following Helen's death were a blur of funeral arrangements, estate lawyers, and well-meaning neighbors bringing casseroles. Madison took a semester off from school to help settle her mother's affairs and support her grieving father. It was during this time that she noticed subtle changes in the dynamics at home. Veronica began staying later at the office, often working until after Robert came home. She started bringing him dinner when he worked late, citing concerns about his health and eating habits. She organized Helen's belongings with clinical efficiency, boxing up clothes and personal items that Madison wasn't emotionally ready to handle. At the time, Madison had been grateful for Veronica's practical approach to the overwhelming task of managing grief and logistics simultaneously. But as months passed, Madison began to notice that Veronica's influence extended beyond professional boundaries. She rearranged Robert's home office for better productivity. She suggested changing the family's longtime housekeeper, Mrs. Rodriguez, claiming they needed fresh energy in the house. She even convinced Robert to update his wardrobe, replacing his comfortable sweaters and familiar cologne with more contemporary styles that, Madison noticed, aligned with Veronica's own sophisticated aesthetic. The transformation was gradual enough that Madison initially attributed it to her father's natural process of moving forward with his life. She was proud of him for not retreating entirely into grief, and she genuinely appreciated how Veronica had helped stabilize their daily routines during an impossible time. Madison completed her master's degree last spring and moved back to the family home, planning to start her career as an art therapist while living in the familiar comfort of her childhood bedroom. She looked forward to spending time with her father, creating new traditions that honored her mother's memory while building something meaningful for their future. The house itself had been left to Madison in her mother's will, a decision Helen had made to ensure her daughter would always have a secure foundation, regardless of what life brought her way. Helen had inherited the property from her own parents and wanted to continue the tradition of passing it through the maternal line. Robert had his business, his investments, and his own family property in Vermont, so the arrangement seemed natural and fair to everyone involved. Madison loved every corner of the Maple Ridge house. Her art studio occupied the entire third floor, where enormous windows provided perfect natural light for her paintings. She'd converted the former servants' quarters into a cozy retreat where she could work on her therapy techniques and prepare for her counseling sessions. The middle floor housed the main living areas and her parents' former bedroom, which Madison had respectfully left untouched since her mother's passing. Her own room on the second floor overlooked the garden and provided a sense of continuity with her childhood. Living in the house again had been healing for Madison. She established routines that honored both her independence and her connection to family history. She tended to her mother's roses, hosted small gatherings for old friends, and slowly began to envision a future where the house would once again be filled with warmth and purpose. Her relationship with her father had been slowly improving as well. Robert seemed to appreciate having Madison home, and they've begun sharing quiet dinners and occasional walks around the neighborhood. He was still grieving, still adjusting to life without Helen, but Madison felt optimistic about their ability to support each other through the ongoing process of healing and rebuilding. Veronica continued to be an important part of Robert's daily life, managing his schedule and handling the complex details of his business operations. Madison respected their professional relationship and had even grown fond of Veronica's dry sense of humor and remarkable organizational skills. She seemed to genuinely care about Robert's well-being, and Madison felt grateful that her father had such reliable support during his vulnerable period. The house on Maple Ridge Drive represented continuity, security, and possibility for Madison. It was the place where she intended to build her therapy practice, where she hoped to eventually raise her own family, and where she could honor her mother's legacy while creating something uniquely her own. Every room held memories, but also potential for new experiences and growth. Madison had no way of knowing that this foundation, everything she considered stable and permanent in her life, was about to shift dramatically. The comfortable routines, the clear boundaries, and the assumed future she'd been building were all about to be challenged in ways she never could have anticipated. As summer approached, Madison felt genuinely hopeful about the direction of her life. She had her education, her inheritance, her relationship with her father, and a clear sense of purpose. She was 24 years old, financially secure, and surrounded by the tangible reminders of a family legacy she was proud to continue. The stage was set,
The players were in position, and Madison Williams had no idea that her carefully reconstructed world was about to be turned completely upside down.
Preparing and narrating this story took us a lot of time, so if you are enjoying it, subscribe to our channel. It means a lot to us. Now, back to the story. The first sign that something fundamental had shifted came on a humid Thursday evening in late June. Madison had just finished setting up her art therapy practice in the third-floor studio when she heard unfamiliar voices drifting up from the kitchen below. She descended the stairs to find Veronica directing two men in matching polo shirts as they maneuvered a large burgundy leather sectional through the front door. "Careful with the corners," Veronica instructed, her voice carrying the authority of someone completely comfortable in the space. That piece cost more than most people's cars. Madison stood frozen on the staircase, watching as the movers positioned the sectional exactly where her mother's beloved floral sofa had sat for over 2 decades. The sofa where Madison had spent countless evenings reading with Helen, where they'd wrapped Christmas presents together, where her mother had taught her to knit during long winter afternoons. "Dad?" Madison called out, her voice smaller than she'd intended. Robert emerged from the kitchen carrying 2 glasses of wine. His hair was freshly cut in a style Madison didn't recognize, and he was wearing a navy blazer she'd never seen before. "Madison, perfect timing. Veronica and I have some news to share." Veronica accepted the glass of wine with a smile that seemed to illuminate her entire face. She'd changed from her usual business attire into a flowing emerald dress that complemented her auburn hair perfectly. For the first time since Madison had known her, Veronica looked relaxed, almost radiant. "Your father and I have decided to take our relationship to the next level," Veronica announced, moving closer to Robert and slipping her arm through his. "We're moving in together." The words hit Madison like a physical blow. She gripped the banister to steady herself, trying to process what she was hearing. "Moving in together? But this is my house." Robert's expression grew uncomfortable. "Madison, sweetheart, I know this is sudden, but Veronica and I have been growing closer over the past year, and it feels right. She's been such an incredible support system, and we've discovered we're compatible in ways I never expected." "Compatible." Madison repeated the word as if it were foreign. "Mom has been gone for 2 years, Dad. 2 years." "I loved your mother more than life itself," Robert said, his voice growing firm. "But Helen wouldn't have wanted me to spend the rest of my life alone. She actually told me, during one of her lucid moments near the end, that she hoped I'd find companionship again someday." This revelation stunned Madison into silence. Her mother had never mentioned anything like that to her. Had Helen really given Robert her blessing to move on, or was this a convenient memory that had grown more detailed over time? Veronica stepped forward, her expression gentle but determined. "Madison, I want you to know that I have tremendous respect for your mother's memory and for your relationship with your father. I'm not trying to replace anyone or erase anything. I'm simply hoping to build something new alongside what already exists." The diplomatic language felt rehearsed, as if Veronica had prepared for this exact conversation. Madison realized that while she'd been focusing on her studies and career plans, an entire relationship had been developing right under her nose. "How long has this been going on?" Madison asked. Robert and Veronica exchanged a glance that spoke volumes. "We've been exploring our feelings for about 8 months," Robert admitted. "We wanted to be certain about our connection before involving you in the conversation." 8 months. Madison calculated backwards, realizing that her father had been romantically involved with Veronica since shortly after she'd left for her final semester at Yale. All those phone calls where he seemed more upbeat, all those mentions of Veronica's helpfulness and efficiency, they hadn't just been about professional collaboration. "I see," Madison said, though she didn't see it all. "And the furniture? We thought it would be nice to refresh some of the common areas. Create a space that feels welcoming for everyone. I hope you don't mind that I took the initiative. Your father mentioned that you'd been wanting to redecorate anyway." Madison had never said anything about redecorating. If anything, she'd been protective of maintaining the house exactly as her mother had arranged it. But contradicting Veronica in front of her father felt like starting a war she wasn't prepared to fight. Over the following days, more changes appeared with startling efficiency. Veronica's belongings arrived in carefully labeled boxes that seemed to multiply overnight. Her extensive wardrobe filled half of Robert's closet. Her collection of contemporary art books replaced Helen's gardening magazines on the living room shelves. Her stainless steel coffee machine displaced the ancient percolator that had been making the family's morning coffee for 15 years. Each change was small, reasonable, and presented as an improvement. Veronica never threw anything away without asking, never made unilateral decisions about major alterations, and never spoke dismissively about Helen's memory. But somehow, the house began to feel like a different place entirely. Madison found herself retreating more frequently to her third-floor studio, the only space that remained entirely her own. She'd sit at her easel, ostensibly working on paintings for her therapy practice, but actually trying to process the rapid transformation of her living situation. The sounds from below had changed, too. Veronica's laughter was sharper than Helen's had been, her conversations with Robert more animated and intellectual, her presence somehow both lighter and more commanding. The most jarring change was in Robert himself. Madison had expected that his grief would gradually soften, that he'd slowly find ways to engage with life again while maintaining his essential character. But the man living downstairs seemed like an updated version of her father, more energetic, more social, more confident, but also somehow less familiar. He started hosting dinner parties for Veronica's friends from her previous job at a Hartford consulting firm. He began reading books about wine appreciation and contemporary philosophy. He purchased a gym membership and started wearing cologne that smelled nothing like the woodsy aftershave Madison associated with weekend mornings and bedtime stories. "Your father is blossoming," Veronica told Madison one evening as they crossed paths in the kitchen. "It's beautiful to watch someone rediscover their zest for life." Madison wanted to argue that her father had never lacked zest, that he'd been a vibrant, engaged person even during his marriage to Helen. But she realized she was comparing the Robert of her childhood to the Robert of today, and perhaps her perspective was colored by nostalgia and grief. The first real conflict emerged over something seemingly trivial: the garden. Madison had been maintaining her mother's roses religiously, treating the garden as both a memorial and a therapeutic practice. She'd researched proper pruning techniques, invested in quality fertilizers, and spent hours each week ensuring that Helen's prized bushes continued to thrive. But Veronica had different ideas about landscaping. She hired a design consultant who recommended replacing the high-maintenance roses with a more sustainable and modern approach featuring native plants and decorative grasses. The proposal was undeniably beautiful, professionally rendered, and environmentally conscious. "I'm not suggesting we eliminate everything," Veronica assured Madison during their first direct confrontation, "but roses require so much water and chemical treatment. This new design would be better for the local ecosystem and much easier to maintain long-term." Madison felt her chest tighten with anger she couldn't quite articulate. "Those roses were my mother's life work. She won awards for them. People drove from other towns just to see them during blooming season." "And they're beautiful," Veronica agreed. "But maintaining them as they are requires professional-level expertise that none of us really possess. I'm thinking about sustainability and practicality." The subtext was clear. Madison's amateur gardening efforts weren't sufficient to preserve Helen's legacy, and clinging to the past was preventing progress toward a more rational future. Robert, when pressed to mediate, sided with Veronica's practical approach while trying to cushion the blow with emotional language. "Maybe we could preserve one section of roses as a memorial to your mother, but allow the rest of the space to evolve into something new." The compromise felt like a defeat to Madison, but she recognized that she was outnumbered and potentially being unreasonable. Was she holding too tightly to the past? Was her attachment to every detail of her mother's choices preventing the natural evolution of a living space? But the garden dispute revealed something more troubling.
Madison's voice in household decisions was consistently being outvoted by the new majority. Robert and Veronica had become a unit that made joint decisions and presented them to Madison as fait accompli. Her input was solicited and politely considered, but ultimately the couple's preferences prevailed. The power dynamic had shifted fundamentally, and Madison was beginning to understand that living in her inherited house didn't necessarily mean controlling what happened within its walls. Legal ownership, she was learning, was different from practical authority. As July progressed, Madison felt increasingly like a guest in her own home. She was always welcome, always included, but somehow never quite in charge of anything that mattered. Veronica's efficiency extended to household management, social planning, and even the family's financial organization. She'd taken over paying bills, coordinating maintenance, and managing the complex logistics of 3 adults sharing space that had previously accommodated a long-married couple and their adult child. Madison tried to convince herself that these changes were positive. Her father seemed genuinely happy for the first time since Helen's death. Veronica was undeniably competent and appeared to care deeply about Robert's well-being. The house was better organized, more social, and arguably more functional than it had been in years. But late at night, alone in her childhood bedroom, Madison couldn't shake the feeling that something essential was being lost in all this improvement and modernization. The house was becoming objectively better, while simultaneously becoming less like home. The catalyst had been set in motion, and Madison Williams was about to discover just how much of her assumed future was actually under her control.
The morning Madison discovered the real estate appraisal documents on the kitchen counter marked the point of no return. She'd come downstairs early, hoping to enjoy a quiet coffee before starting her day with clients, when she spotted the official letterhead from Hartwell and Associates Property Valuations. The thick envelope was addressed to both Robert Williams and Veronica Sterling, and it was already opened. Madison's hands trembled as she pulled out the comprehensive report. The Maple Ridge property had been appraised at $2.8 million, a figure that made her stomach lurch. She'd known the house was valuable, but seeing the number in stark black and white made everything feel suddenly precarious. "You're up early," Veronica's voice came from behind her. Madison spun around, still clutching the appraisal. "What is this?" Veronica poured herself coffee with unhurried precision, her silk robe and perfectly arranged hair making her look like she'd stepped out of a magazine, even at 7 in the morning. "Your father and I are exploring our options. When 2 people decide to build a life together, they need to understand all the financial implications." "Financial implications of what, exactly?" Robert appeared in the doorway, already dressed for work. His expression was carefully neutral, the way it got when he was about to deliver news he knew wouldn't be well received. "Madison, we need to have a family meeting. Tonight, after dinner, there are some things we need to discuss about the long-term arrangement here." The day dragged endlessly. Madison tried to focus on her therapy sessions, but found herself distracted and anxious. Her client, a teenager named Sarah, who was working through family trauma, noticed immediately. "You seem like you're somewhere else today," Sarah observed during their painting exercise. "Is everything okay?" Madison realized she was projecting her own family dysfunction onto her professional space, exactly what she'd been trained never to do. She refocused on Sarah's needs, but the irony wasn't lost on her. She was helping a teenager navigate family instability, while her own family foundation was crumbling. That evening, the 3 of them sat around the dining room table that had once hosted Madison's birthday parties and graduation celebrations. Veronica had prepared an elaborate meal: salmon with herb crust, roasted vegetables, and a bottle of wine that probably cost more than Madison spent on groceries in a month. "This feels like a business meeting," Madison said, trying to lighten the mood. "In some ways, it is," Veronica replied matter-of-factly. "When adults live together, especially when property and finances are involved, it's important to establish clear expectations and boundaries." Robert cleared his throat. "Madison, you know how much I love having you here. You're my daughter, and this will always be your family home. But Veronica has raised some valid concerns about the practical aspects of our current situation." "What kind of concerns?" Veronica opened a leather portfolio and spread several documents across the table. Property taxes on a house this size are $34,000 annually. Utilities average $800 per month. Insurance is $2,200 per year. Maintenance and repairs, just in the past 6 months, have cost $8,500. We're looking at roughly $55,000 in annual carrying costs, not including any improvements or emergency repairs. The numbers hit Madison like physical blows. She'd never fully calculated the cost of maintaining the house because those expenses had always been handled by her parents. Your father has been absorbing all of these costs while you live here rent-free and use significant portions of the house for your business. The third floor is entirely dedicated to your art therapy practice, which generates income that you keep entirely for yourself. Madison's face flushed. This is my inheritance. My mother left me this house. Legally, yes, but legally owning something doesn't eliminate the financial responsibilities that come with it. Your father has essentially been subsidizing your lifestyle and your business while you build your career. Robert shifted uncomfortably. Madison, I don't mind supporting you, but Veronica and I are planning a future together, and we need to be realistic about our financial obligations. We can't indefinitely carry the full burden of maintaining a property this expensive. What are you proposing? Madison asked, though she dreaded the answer. Veronica slid a typed document across the table. We've drafted a fair cost-sharing arrangement. You would contribute $1,800 per month to cover your portion of household expenses, utilities, taxes, insurance, maintenance, and general upkeep. That's significantly less than you'd pay for a comparable living situation anywhere else in the area. Madison stared at the number. $1,800 per month was nearly her entire income from her fledgling therapy practice. I just started my business. I have maybe 6 regular clients. This would bankrupt me. Then perhaps it's time to consider whether this living arrangement is sustainable for everyone involved, Veronica said gently. Young people typically start with smaller, more affordable spaces while they build their careers. There's no shame in that. The implication was clear. Madison could pay up or move out. But this is my house, Madison repeated, feeling increasingly desperate.
And we're not disputing that, Robert said quickly. We're simply asking you to contribute fairly to the costs of maintaining the property you own. It's actually a very reasonable request when you think about it objectively. Madison realized she was being maneuvered into a corner. The logic was sound on the surface. She did live in the house rent-free, she did use significant space for her business, and the carrying costs were substantial. But something about the timing and presentation felt calculated. I need time to think about this, Madison said. Of course, Veronica replied, but we do need a decision within the next 2 weeks. Your father and I are considering our own options, and we need to know what role this property will play in our future plans. What other options? Madison asked. Robert and Veronica exchanged one of their meaningful looks. We've been looking at condominiums in West Hartford, Robert admitted. Veronica has friends in a beautiful complex near the country club. Low maintenance, great amenities, perfect for our lifestyle. Madison felt the blood drain from her face. You're thinking about leaving? We're thinking about what makes the most sense for everyone, Veronica clarified. If living here creates financial strain and tension, maybe it's better for all of us to make different arrangements. The threat was subtle but unmistakable. Madison could either find a way to pay $1,800 per month or risk losing the daily presence of her only remaining family member. The house would still be legally hers, but it would become a lonely monument to a family that no longer existed. Over the next few days, Madison threw herself into research. She called 3 different property management companies to ask about rental rates for comparable properties. She investigated the costs of converting part of the house into rental units, and she even looked into the possibility of taking in roommates to help share expenses. Every option seemed complicated and expensive. Converting the house for multiple tenants would require significant renovations and city permits. Finding compatible roommates for a house this size and formal would be nearly impossible, and renting a comparable property elsewhere would cost even more than the $1,800 Veronica was requesting.
Madison also began paying closer attention to the financial dynamics in the house. She noticed that Veronica had expensive tastes: organic groceries, premium wine, high-end toiletries, fresh flowers delivered weekly. The household expenses they were asking Madison to contribute to included maintaining a lifestyle significantly more luxurious than what Madison had grown up with. But when she tried to discuss these observations with her father, Robert seemed genuinely oblivious to the cost differences. "Veronica handles all the household management now. She's much better at that kind of thing than I ever was. Your mother always took care of those details, and I never paid much attention to the specifics." Madison realized that her father had transferred all domestic authority from Helen to Veronica without ever learning to manage those responsibilities himself. He genuinely didn't know whether they were spending $200 or $600 per month on groceries because he'd never had to track those expenses. The power dynamic became even clearer when Madison tried to negotiate the terms of the proposed arrangement. She suggested contributing $1,200 per month instead of $1,800, or paying a smaller monthly amount, plus taking responsibility for specific maintenance tasks she could handle herself. "We appreciate your willingness to negotiate, but we really need the full amount to make the numbers work. Maintaining a property like this requires professional services, landscaping, cleaning, repairs, that you're not qualified to handle yourself." Madison bristled at the implication that she was incompetent, but she also recognized that Veronica wasn't entirely wrong. Madison knew how to paint walls and plant flowers, but she couldn't repair the HVAC system or handle electrical problems. The 2-week deadline approached with relentless speed. Her sleep became fitful, her appetite disappeared, and she found herself snapping at clients during therapy sessions. The stress was affecting every aspect of her life, and she knew she couldn't continue indefinitely in this state of uncertainty. The night before her decision was due, Madison sat in her third-floor studio, surrounded by canvases that represented hours of therapeutic work with dozens of clients. She'd built something meaningful in this space, something that honored her mother's belief in the healing power of creativity and connection. But she was also forced to confront an uncomfortable truth. Despite inheriting the house, she didn't have the financial resources to maintain it independently. Her mother had left her a beautiful, valuable asset, but not the means to preserve it without help. Madison realized she had 3 realistic options: pay the $1,800 and sacrifice her financial independence, refuse to pay and risk her father moving out, or sell the house and start over somewhere else. None of these choices felt like winning, but Madison knew she had to choose something. The point of no return had arrived, and whatever decision she made would fundamentally alter the trajectory of her life. Standing in the room where she'd spent countless hours helping others navigate their family traumas, Madison prepared to make the commitment that would determine whether she was willing to fight for her inheritance or let it go.
Madison's decision to pay the $1,800 monthly fee unleashed consequences she never could have anticipated. What she'd hoped would buy her peace and stability instead opened the door to an escalating series of demands that transformed her from homeowner to tenant in her own inheritance. The first shock came just 3 weeks after she'd made her initial payment. Madison arrived home from a particularly challenging therapy session to find a crew of workers installing a security system throughout the house. Cameras were being mounted at every entrance, motion sensors positioned in hallways, and a central control panel installed in what used to be her mother's reading nook. "What's all this?" Madison asked Veronica, who was directing the installation with military precision. "Enhanced security," Veronica replied, consulting a tablet that displayed the house's floor plan. "With the increased value of the property and all the expensive renovations we're planning, our insurance company strongly recommended upgrading our protection systems." Madison noticed the pronoun immediately. "Our insurance?" "Your father and I are now listed as co-beneficiaries on the homeowner's policy," Veronica explained matter-of-factly. "Since we're contributing to the maintenance costs and living here full-time, it made sense to ensure we're protected in case of damage or theft." The legal implications hit Madison like a sledgehammer. Somehow, in the 3 weeks since she'd agreed to pay rent, Veronica had managed to get herself added to the insurance policy for a house she didn't own. She realized she had no idea what other documents might have been modified or what other practical arrangements had been made in her name.
I wasn't consulted about any insurance changes, Madison said, trying to keep her voice steady. Your father handled it. He has power of attorney for household matters since he's been managing all the bills and maintenance. I assumed you knew. Madison most definitely did not know. Her father had never mentioned having power of attorney over the property, and she was certain her mother hadn't included such provisions in the will. But confronting Veronica in front of the security installation crew felt inappropriate, so Madison retreated to her studio to process this latest development. That evening, she attempted to discuss the insurance situation with her father, but Robert seemed genuinely confused by her concerns. Veronica handles all the administrative details now, he said, waving dismissively. She's much better at that kind of paperwork than I am. If she says it's necessary for insurance purposes, I trust her judgment. But Dad, you can't just add people to insurance policies for property you don't own. Miney, I've been paying the premiums on that policy for 20 years. I think I understand how insurance works. Madison realized that her father either didn't understand the legal distinctions between paying for insurance and having authority over it, or he was deliberately avoiding the conversation. Either way, she was dealing with changes to her property that she had no control over. The security system became operational the following week, and Madison discovered that Veronica had programmed herself as the primary administrator. This meant that Veronica could monitor who entered and left the house, set and change access codes, and receive alerts about all activity on the property. It's just more efficient this way, Veronica explained when Madison questioned the arrangement. I'm here most consistently, so I can respond quickly if there are any issues. Plus, your father isn't great with technology, and you're often busy with clients during the day. The logic was reasonable, but the result was that Madison now needed permission from Veronica to give access codes to friends, service providers, or even her own clients who occasionally came to the house for sessions. Her movements were being tracked in her own home, and she had no administrative control over the system monitoring her. More unsettling changes followed in rapid succession. Veronica hired a professional housekeeping service that came 3 times per week, replacing Mrs. Rodriguez, who had been cleaning for the family for over a decade. The new service was more expensive, but, according to Veronica, better suited to maintaining a property of this caliber. Mrs. Rodriguez had been more than just a housekeeper. She'd been like family, someone who remembered Madison's childhood and maintained connections to her mother's memory. Her replacement was efficient but impersonal, treating the house like any other wealthy client's property rather than a family home with history and sentiment. I offered Mrs. Rodriguez the opportunity to work with the new service, Veronica told Madison, when she expressed disappointment, but she declined. Sometimes people resist change, even when it's clearly an improvement. Madison suspected that Mrs. Rodriguez had been offered less money or fewer hours, making the position financially unworkable. But she had no way to verify this without seeming to undermine Veronica's authority in household management. The financial pressures intensified when Madison received her first quarterly assessment in late September. Veronica had prepared a detailed spreadsheet showing that household expenses had exceeded projections due to necessary improvements and unexpected maintenance issues. The list was extensive. Emergency plumbing repairs, $2,400, professional landscaping consultation, $1,800, window cleaning and gutter maintenance, $900, and upgraded appliances for the kitchen, $5,200. Madison's quarterly share of these overages came to an additional $1,100.
I wasn't consulted about any of these expenditures, Madison pointed out. These weren't discretionary purchases, Veronica replied. The plumbing issue was an emergency. We had water damage that could have been catastrophic if we delayed. The other items were maintenance necessities identified during professional inspections. Madison had no way to dispute the necessity of the repairs because she hadn't been present when the problems were discovered or when the service providers had given their assessments. She was being asked to pay for decisions made without her input or consent. When she tried to insist on being consulted before future expenditures, Veronica pointed out that Madison was often unavailable during business hours when emergencies occurred or when service providers were available. We can't delay necessary repairs while we wait for your schedule to align with household needs. That's not practical for anyone. Madison found herself trapped in an impossible situation. She was financially responsible for decisions she wasn't included in making, but her work schedule and relative inexperience with home maintenance made her an impractical decision-maker for urgent issues. The power dynamic shifted further when Veronica announced that she would be working from home more frequently, converting Helen's former sewing room into a home office for her consulting business. It makes sense for me to have dedicated workspace here. I can coordinate household management more efficiently, and it saves money on office rent that would otherwise come out of our household budget. Madison realized that Veronica was now running a business from Madison's inherited property, potentially generating income from space that Madison was paying to maintain. But when she raised this concern, Veronica pointed out that Madison was also using the house for her therapy practice. The difference is that I inherited this house specifically to live and work in. You're a tenant who's now operating a business without asking permission from the property owner. I'm hardly a tenant, Veronica coolly replied. I'm your father's partner, contributing significantly to the maintenance and improvement of this property. If anything, we're all partners in maintaining a valuable family asset. The word partners sent chills down Madison's spine. Veronica was positioning herself not as a renter or even as Robert's girlfriend, but as an equal stakeholder in the property Madison had inherited. Madison's attempts to establish boundaries became increasingly futile. When she suggested that major decisions about the house should require her approval as the legal owner, Veronica pointed out that Madison lacked the expertise to evaluate most maintenance and improvement needs. When Madison proposed that they establish a formal lease agreement defining everyone's rights and responsibilities, Veronica argued that family relationships shouldn't be reduced to landlord-tenant dynamics. When Madison asked to see detailed receipts for all the expenses she was being asked to share, Veronica expressed hurt that Madison didn't trust her financial management. Every reasonable request Madison made was reframed as either impractical, hurtful, or evidence that Madison didn't appreciate the complexity of maintaining a property like theirs. Madison's therapy practice began suffering as her personal stress mounted. She found herself distracted during sessions, irritable with clients, and unable to maintain the emotional boundaries necessary for effective therapeutic work. Her income decreased as some clients sensed her instability and sought services elsewhere. The irony was devastating. The financial pressure that had driven her to accept Veronica's arrangement was undermining her ability to earn the money she needed to meet her obligations. Madison's few attempts to seek support from friends and extended family were met with responses that made her feel even more isolated. Most people saw her situation as privileged. She owned a multi-million-dollar house and was complaining about paying $1,800 in monthly expenses. "Can't you just sell the house if it's too expensive to maintain?" her college friend Emma asked. "Most people would kill to have that kind of asset." Madison tried to explain that selling meant losing her family's legacy, her mother's memory, and the foundation for her therapy practice. But these emotional attachments seemed abstract to people who viewed the house primarily as a financial asset. Her cousin David was more understanding, but equally unhelpful. "It sounds like your dad's girlfriend is pretty controlling, but if she's paying half the bills, doesn't she deserve some say in how things are managed?" Madison realized that outsiders couldn't understand the subtle manipulation involved because, on the surface, Veronica's requests seemed reasonable. She wasn't obviously cruel or abusive. She was efficient, organized, and committed to maintaining an expensive property. The problem was that her efficiency was systematically eroding Madison's autonomy and authority in her own home. By October, Madison felt completely trapped. She was paying more than she could afford for the privilege of being a minority voice in decisions about her own inheritance. Her attempts to establish ownership rights were consistently undermined by practical arguments about expertise, availability, and financial contribution. The reality check was complete. Legal ownership of the house didn't translate to actual control over her living situation, and Madison Williams was about to discover just how much more she stood to lose.
The breaking point came on a rain-soaked November morning when Madison discovered that the locks on her own house had been changed overnight. She stood on a front porch at 6:30 a.m.,
coffee-stained pajamas clinging to her shivering body, jabbing her key uselessly into a lock that no longer recognized her. She'd left the house at midnight to drive her client Emma Patterson to the emergency room after the 17-year-old had suffered a panic attack during their evening session. Emma's parents were out of town, and Madison couldn't leave a minor in crisis alone. She'd spent 4 hours in the hospital waiting room, ensuring Emma was stable before driving her to her grandmother's house for the night. Now, exhausted and desperate to get inside her own home, Madison was locked out like a stranger. Her phone calls to her father went straight to voicemail. When she finally reached Veronica at 7 a.m., the response was delivered with bureaucratic calm. The security company recommended upgrading to smart locks after detecting some vulnerabilities in the old system, Veronica explained. I've texted you the new access code. Madison's phone buzzed with a 6-digit number, but the humiliation burned deeper than the practical inconvenience. She hadn't been consulted about changing the locks on her own house, and she was now dependent on Veronica for access to her inheritance. Why wasn't I told this was happening? Madison asked, her voice cracking with exhaustion and rage. It was an emergency security upgrade, Veronica replied. The technician was only available last night, and we couldn't wait. I assumed you'd appreciate having better security, especially since you often come and go at unusual hours. The implication stung. Madison's work schedule, which required flexibility for client emergencies, was being framed as suspicious or problematic behavior that justified security measures against her. Inside the house, Madison discovered more changes that had occurred during her absence. Her mother's antique piano had been moved from the living room to the basement, replaced by a sleek white desk where Veronica's laptop and business materials were now permanently stationed. The piano was taking up too much space, Robert explained, when Madison confronted him. Veronica needs a proper workspace for her consulting business, and none of us actually play piano anymore. The piano had been Helen's most treasured possession, a 1920s Steinway baby grand that had belonged to Madison's great-grandmother. Helen had played it every Sunday morning, filling the house with Chopin and Mozart while the family prepared for the day. Madison had been taking lessons on that piano when her mother became ill, and she'd planned to resume playing as part of her own healing process. I was going to start playing again, Madison said weakly. When? Veronica asked. You've been living here for 6 months and haven't touched it once. It makes more sense to use the space for something productive. Madison realized that her intentions and future plans carried no weight in household decisions. Only current, measurable usage mattered, and she had no evidence to counter Veronica's efficiency-based logic. The piano incident triggered something desperate in Madison. That evening, she drove to the office of Patricia Hawkins, an estate planning attorney her mother had mentioned years earlier. Madison had never needed legal advice before, but she was drowning in a situation she couldn't navigate alone. Patricia's office was cramped and cluttered, nothing like the sleek legal dramas Madison had seen on television. Patricia herself was a 60-something woman with graying hair and tired eyes who listened to Madison's story with increasing concern. Let me see if I understand correctly, Patricia said, reviewing the notes she'd taken. You inherited the house outright from your mother, but your father and his girlfriend have systematically assumed administrative control over insurance, security, maintenance, and household management? Exactly, Madison said, feeling validated for the first time in months. Patricia frowned as she examined copies of the documents Madison had brought. This insurance modification is particularly troubling. Your father shouldn't have been able to add another party as a beneficiary without your consent as the property owner. He claims he has power of attorney for household matters, Madison said. Power of attorney for what? Patricia asked sharply. Did your mother grant him any ongoing authority over the property in her will? Madison realized she'd never actually read her mother's will in detail. She'd been told about inheriting the house, but she'd never examined the specific language or conditions involved. Patricia requested a copy of the complete will and scheduled a follow-up appointment for the next week.
For the first time since the nightmare began, Madison felt like someone was taking her concerns seriously and treating them as legitimate legal issues rather than family drama. But Madison's hope was short-lived. When she returned home that evening, she found Robert and Veronica waiting in the living room with expressions that made her stomach clench with dread. "We need to talk," Robert said, his voice more serious than Madison had heard since her mother's funeral. Veronica had prepared another folder of documents, but this time her demeanor was less diplomatic and more businesslike. "Madison, your father and I have been discussing the sustainability of our current arrangement, and we've reached some difficult conclusions."
Madison's mouth went dry. What kind of conclusions? Robert shifted uncomfortably. "Sweetheart, living together isn't working for any of us. The financial stress, the constant tension about household decisions, the different expectations about how this property should be managed, it's not healthy for anyone." "So what are you suggesting?" Madison asked, though she already suspected the answer. Veronica slid a formal-looking document across the coffee table. "We're proposing a buyout arrangement. Your father and I would purchase your ownership interest in the house for fair market value, and you'd be free to start fresh somewhere that better suits your budget and lifestyle." Madison stared at the paper without reading it, her vision blurring with tears she refused to let fall. "You want to buy me out of my own inheritance?" "We want to find a solution that works for everyone," Veronica corrected. "You're clearly struggling financially to maintain this property, and the stress is affecting your work and your health. This would give you substantial capital to start over without the burden of property management." The offer was for $1.4 million, exactly half the appraised value of the house. On paper, it seemed generous. In reality, it was Madison's family legacy being reduced to a real estate transaction. "I need time to think about this," Madison said. "Of course, but we do need an answer within 30 days. Veronica and I are ready to move forward with our lives, and we can't do that in this state of uncertainty." Madison spent the next week researching her options with increasing desperation. She consulted with 2 mortgage brokers about refinancing the house to buy out Robert and Veronica's claimed interest, but her income was too low and too unstable to qualify for a loan of that size. She investigated the possibility of converting the house into rental units to generate income, but the zoning restrictions and renovation costs made that option financially impossible. She even considered accepting a partnership arrangement where she maintained ownership but Robert and Veronica handled all management responsibilities, but she realized this would leave her as a silent partner in her own inheritance with no real control over her living situation. Every option seemed designed to either bankrupt her, displace her, or reduce her to a powerless minority stakeholder in property that should have been entirely hers. The legal consultation with Patricia Hawkins yielded devastating news. After reviewing Helen's will and the subsequent insurance modifications, Patricia discovered that Robert had indeed been granted limited power of attorney, but only for financial matters during Helen's illness, and those powers should have expired upon Helen's death. The insurance changes were made improperly, but challenging them would require expensive litigation, and there's no guarantee we could reverse modifications that have been in place for months. More troubling was Patricia's discovery that the power of attorney documents Robert was citing appeared to have been modified after Helen's death. The language granting him authority over household financial matters wasn't in the original will. "This looks like document tampering," Patricia said gravely, "but proving it would require forensic analysis and potentially criminal investigation. Are you prepared for that level of legal warfare with your own father?" Madison stared at the evidence of possible fraud committed by her only remaining family member. The idea of accusing her father of forgery felt like a betrayal of everything she'd believed about their relationship. But the alternative was losing her inheritance to what might be an elaborate legal manipulation orchestrated by Veronica. On Thanksgiving Day, Madison sat alone in her third-floor studio while Robert and Veronica hosted an elegant dinner party downstairs for Veronica's friends and colleagues. She hadn't been disinvited, but the guest list was entirely Veronica's social circle, and she felt like an unwelcome intrusion
in what was supposed to be her own home. As laughter and conversation drifted up from below, Madison realized that she'd become a stranger in her own life. The house no longer felt like home. Her relationship with her father had become a series of negotiations mediated by Veronica, and her financial situation was spiraling toward bankruptcy. She was facing the complete loss of everything her mother had intended to leave her, not through any failure of her own, but through a systematic campaign of manipulation that had left her isolated, powerless, and emotionally shattered. The crisis was complete. Madison Williams had to decide whether to surrender her inheritance and start over with nothing, or fight a legal battle that might destroy her relationship with her father while bankrupting her in the process. Either way, the girl who had once felt secure in her family's love and her own future was gone forever.
The turning point came from an unexpected source, Mrs. Rodriguez, the former housekeeper whom Veronica had replaced months earlier. Madison encountered her by chance at the grocery store on a gray December morning, and what started as a polite greeting became the conversation that changed everything. "Mija, you look terrible," Mrs. Rodriguez said, her weathered hands reaching out to touch Madison's face with maternal concern. "What is that woman doing to you?" Madison hadn't realized how obvious her deterioration had become until she saw herself reflected in Mrs. Rodriguez's worried eyes. She'd lost 15 pounds, her hair was dull from stress, and dark circles shadowed her face like bruises. "It's complicated, Mrs. Rodriguez," Madison began, but the older woman cut her off with a sharp gesture. "Nothing is complicated about what I saw," Mrs. Rodriguez said firmly. "That woman, she was planning this from the beginning. I heard things, I saw documents she thought I couldn't read because my English isn't perfect. But I clean houses for 40 years, mija. I know when someone is stealing." Mrs. Rodriguez insisted they sit in her car in the parking lot, away from potential eavesdroppers. What she revealed over the next hour shattered Madison's understanding of everything that had happened to her family. 6 months before your mother died, that woman was already asking me questions, Mrs. Rodriguez said. She wanted to know about the house papers, about your father's business, about how much money the family had. She said she was helping with insurance, but she was taking pictures of documents when your father wasn't looking. Madison felt her heart racing. What kind of documents? Your mother's will, the house papers, bank statements, everything. She had a little camera, very small. She thought I didn't notice, but I see everything when I clean. Mrs. Rodriguez reached into her purse and pulled out a small manila envelope. "I kept some things I thought were important. Your mother, she asked me to watch over you after she was gone. She was worried about your father, said he wasn't good with business things and people might take advantage." Inside the envelope were photocopies of documents Madison had never seen before. The original power of attorney papers her mother had signed, which clearly stated that Robert's authority was limited to medical and immediate financial decisions during Helen's illness and would expire upon her death or recovery. "This is not what my father showed the insurance company," Madison said, comparing the documents. "Someone changed these." "That woman, she had your father sign many papers during the worst time, when your mother was very sick," Mrs. Rodriguez explained. "He didn't read them careful. She said they were for insurance, for medical bills, for taking care of your mother. But some of those papers, they were different than what she said." Mrs. Rodriguez had more devastating information. During her final weeks working for the family, she'd overheard phone conversations between Veronica and someone named Marcus, whom Veronica referred to as her business partner. She was talking about timelines, about when to make the next move. She said the daughter would be easy to handle because she was emotional and didn't understand money. She said the father was already completely dependent on her and would do whatever she wanted. Madison felt physically sick. The woman she'd been trying to accommodate and understand had been systematically planning to steal her inheritance from the moment she'd entered their lives. "Why didn't you tell me this sooner?" Madison asked. Mrs. Rodriguez's eyes filled with tears. "Who would believe the housekeeper against the educated lady with the fancy clothes? And your father, he was so angry when I tried to ask questions about the papers. He said I was causing trouble during a difficult time."
Madison realized that Mrs. Rodriguez had tried to warn them, but grief and Veronica's manipulation had made Robert defensive against anyone who questioned the new arrangements. Armed with this new information, Madison returned to Patricia Hawkins' office with renewed determination. Patricia examined the original power of attorney documents with growing excitement. "This is exactly what we need," Patricia said. "We can prove that the documents used to modify the insurance were fraudulent, but more importantly, we can demonstrate a pattern of deception that puts all of Veronica's actions into question." Patricia explained that they now had grounds for several legal actions: insurance fraud, document forgery, and potentially elder abuse, since Robert had been manipulated during his period of grief and vulnerability. "The challenge," Patricia warned, "is that your father will likely be implicated in some of these actions, even if he was a victim of manipulation. Are you prepared for that possibility?" Madison thought about the man who had once taught her to ride a bicycle and helped her with math homework, compared to the stranger who now allowed Veronica to dictate terms in Madison's own home. She realized that saving her father might require temporarily opposing him. "I have to try," Madison said. "If I don't fight this, Veronica wins everything, and my father loses his independence along with my inheritance." Patricia recommended hiring a private investigator to research Veronica's background and financial history. "If this woman has done this before, there might be a pattern we can expose."
The investigator, David Chen, was a former police detective who specialized in financial fraud cases. Within a week, he uncovered information that shocked even Patricia's experienced legal team. Veronica Sterling wasn't her real name. She was actually Veronica Steinberg, and she had a history of targeting wealthy widowers and their families. Over the past decade, she'd been involved in 3 similar situations in different states, each time positioning herself as an indispensable helper during family crises and gradually assuming control over valuable assets. Her previous targets lost a combined $4.2 million to various schemes, David reported. In 2 cases, adult children were completely cut out of inheritances they should have received. In the 3rd case, the widower ended up signing over his business to her before his children could intervene. Most disturbing was the discovery that Marcus, Veronica's business partner, was actually her husband of 12 years. They operated as a team, with Veronica establishing relationships with vulnerable targets while Marcus handled the legal and financial manipulation from behind the scenes. "Your father isn't just being manipulated," David explained. "He's being systematically defrauded by professional criminals who have perfected this operation through multiple victims." Armed with this evidence, Patricia filed for an emergency injunction to freeze all changes to the insurance policies and property arrangements while they investigated the full extent of the fraud. She also filed a complaint with the district attorney's office, requesting a criminal investigation of the forged documents. Madison's confrontation with her father was the most difficult conversation of her life. She presented the evidence in his home office, the same room where Veronica had been photographing documents years earlier. Robert's initial reaction was defensive anger. "This is ridiculous, Madison. Veronica has been nothing but helpful and supportive. I can't believe you're trying to destroy my relationship because you don't want to pay your fair share of expenses." But as Madison showed him the original power of attorney documents, the evidence of Veronica's false identity, and the records of her previous victims, Robert's expression gradually changed from anger to confusion to horror. "She told me these papers were just updates to make everything legal," Robert said, staring at the forged documents. "She said the lawyers recommended the changes to protect the family assets." Madison watched her father realize that he'd been manipulated by a professional criminal who had targeted him during the most vulnerable period of his life. The man who had always prided himself on his business acumen had been thoroughly deceived by someone who specialized in exploiting grief and loneliness. "Where's she now?" Robert asked, his voice barely a whisper. "Probably destroying evidence and planning her exit strategy. David thinks she and Marcus will disappear as soon as they realize we've discovered their real identities." Robert sat in stunned silence for several minutes, processing the magnitude of his betrayal.
When he finally spoke, his voice was stronger than Madison had heard in months. What do we need to do to stop her? For the first time since the nightmare began, Madison felt like she had an ally instead of an opponent. The father she remembered was still there, buried under months of manipulation and false dependency, but ready to fight for his family's future. "We need to act fast," Madison said. "Patricia thinks we can recover most of what she's taken, but only if we move before she realizes we know the truth." The breakthrough had arrived not through Madison's individual strength, but through the collective power of people who had been watching, waiting, and caring about her family's welfare. Mrs. Rodriguez's courage in speaking up, Patricia's legal expertise, David's investigative skills, and Robert's willingness to admit he'd been deceived had combined to create a path forward. Madison Williams was no longer fighting alone, and for the first time in months, she believed she might actually win.
The operation to expose Veronica began at dawn on a frigid January morning. Madison and her father sat in David Chen's surveillance van outside their own house, watching through high-tech equipment as federal agents prepared to execute search warrants simultaneously at the Maple Ridge property and Marcus Steinberg's office in Hartford. "FBI Financial Crimes Unit," the lead agent announced as she rang the doorbell at exactly 6 a.m. Madison watched through the van's monitors as Veronica answered the door in her silk robe, her face cycling through confusion, shock, and finally, cold calculation as she realized her carefully constructed world was collapsing. "This is a mistake," Veronica's voice crackled through the surveillance equipment. "I'm Robert Williams' partner. I live here legally." Agent Sarah Martinez, a 20-year veteran of financial fraud cases, wasn't impressed by Veronica's performance. "Ma'am, we have warrants to search this property and seize all documents related to insurance fraud, identity theft, and elder abuse. Please step aside." Madison felt her father's hand grip hers as they watched agents stream into their family home. After months of feeling powerless, seeing law enforcement treat Veronica as a criminal suspect instead of a respected household authority was almost surreal. The search revealed evidence that stunned even the experienced investigators. Hidden in Veronica's home office were detailed files on 12 different wealthy families in Connecticut, complete with financial profiles, psychological assessments, and what appeared to be strategic plans for infiltrating their lives. "She's been running a much larger operation than we suspected," Agent Martinez explained to Madison and Robert during a break in the search. The Williams family was just one target in an extensive criminal enterprise. Among the most damning evidence was a notebook in Veronica's handwriting that detailed her entire strategy for the Williams family. The entries, dating back 2 years, revealed the cold calculation behind every seemingly helpful gesture. Day 127. Helen is deteriorating rapidly. Robert is completely overwhelmed. Perfect opportunity to position myself as indispensable. Must time the romantic advance carefully. Too soon appears opportunistic. Too late risks losing emotional dependency. Day 203. Robert signed modified POA without reading, Helen too weak to notice discrepancies, Madison distracted by school. All major obstacles neutralized. Day 289. Helen died last night, Robert completely broken. Marcus says this is optimal timing for Phase 2. Must maintain grief counselor persona while establishing romantic connection. Madison felt physically sick reading the clinical descriptions of her family's most vulnerable moments. Every kindness Veronica had shown, every moment of apparent genuine care, had been calculated manipulation designed to gain access to their assets. The most shocking discovery came when agents found correspondence between Veronica and a lawyer in the Cayman Islands discussing offshore accounts containing over $3.8 million in assets stolen from previous victims. She wasn't just planning to steal your inheritance. She was preparing to disappear internationally when she'd extracted maximum value from your father's assets. The notebook revealed that Veronica's original timeline called for marriage to Robert within 18 months, followed by gradual transfer of all his business assets to accounts she controlled. Madison's resistance had accelerated the timeline, forcing Veronica to attempt the buyout scheme earlier than planned. "Your refusal to be manipulated probably saved your father's entire financial future," Agent Martinez told Madison. "If you'd accepted that buyout, she would have had legal standing to claim community property rights to everything." Marcus Steinberg's arrest at his Hartford office yielded additional evidence of the couple's criminal operation. His computers contained detailed psychological profiles of potential targets, including notes about optimal timing for approaching grieving widowers and strategies for isolating them from protective family members. The scope of their crimes was staggering. Over 8 years, Veronica and Marcus had stolen nearly $6 million from 7 different families across 3 states. Their method was consistent: identify wealthy men who had recently lost their wives, infiltrate their lives during the grieving process, gradually assume control over financial decisions, and systematically transfer assets to accounts they controlled. The Williams case was actually their most ambitious. Previous targets were older men with limited family connections. Your father was younger, with a protective daughter and valuable business assets. They had to develop more sophisticated techniques. The evidence also revealed why Madison had felt so confused about her father's behavior. Veronica had been systematically isolating Robert from his longtime friends and advisors, replacing them with people who were either part of her network or easily manipulated.
Dr. Richard Hoffman, Robert's physician for 20 years, had been replaced by Dr. Susan Palmer, who had been prescribing Robert anxiety medication that made him more compliant and less likely to question authority. Robert's longtime accountant had been replaced by someone who worked directly with Marcus to facilitate the fraudulent document modifications. "I thought I was making good decisions," Robert said, his voice hollow with shame. "Every change felt logical at the time, but now I realize she was orchestrating my entire life." The pharmaceutical manipulation was particularly disturbing. Dr. Palmer had been prescribing Robert increasingly strong anti-anxiety medications, telling him they were necessary to help him process his grief. The medications had side effects that included memory problems and reduced critical thinking capacity. "She was literally drugging him to make him more compliant," Agent Martinez explained. "It's a sophisticated form of chemical manipulation that we're seeing more frequently in elder abuse cases." Blood tests revealed that Robert had been receiving nearly 3 times the standard dosage of benzodiazepines, explaining why he'd seemed so different over the past year. His personality changes hadn't been natural grief responses. They'd been chemically induced to make him easier to control. As Robert began reducing the medication under proper medical supervision, Madison watched her real father slowly reemerge. His critical thinking sharpened, his memory improved, and his natural protective instincts toward Madison returned. "I can't believe I let her convince me you were being unreasonable," Robert said during one of their long conversations as his mind cleared. "Everything you questioned was absolutely legitimate, but I couldn't think clearly enough to see it." The legal proceedings moved swiftly once the evidence was assembled. Veronica and Marcus were charged with federal fraud, money laundering, identity theft, and elder abuse. The case attracted national media attention as prosecutors revealed the scope of their criminal enterprise. Madison found herself testifying before a federal grand jury, describing how this systematic manipulation had unfolded over 18 months. Her detailed account helped prosecutors understand the psychological techniques the couple had used to maintain control over their victims. "Your testimony was crucial," prosecutor Amanda Richardson told Madison after the hearing. "Most victims of this type of fraud are too embarrassed to admit they were deceived. Your willingness to speak publicly helps other families recognize similar patterns." The financial recovery exceeded everyone's expectations. Federal agents traced the offshore accounts and recovered not only the money stolen from the Williams family, but assets belonging to previous victims who had given up hope of ever seeing justice. Madison's inheritance was fully restored, including compensation for the fraudulent expenses she'd been forced to pay. More importantly, Robert's business assets were protected and his reputation in the community was preserved when the full extent of the manipulation became public.
The house on Maple Ridge Drive required months of restoration to return it to its original character. Madison and Robert worked together to remove all traces of Veronica's influence, replacing her modern additions with furnishings that honored Helen's memory while creating space for new family traditions. Madison's mother's piano was restored to its place of honor in the living room, and Robert surprised Madison by taking lessons so they could play duets together. The garden was replanted with Helen's original roses, supplemented by new varieties that Madison selected to represent growth and renewal. Most importantly, Madison's relationship with her father was transformed through their shared experience of survival and recovery. They'd been through the worst kind of betrayal together and emerged stronger, more honest, and more protective of each other. "Your mother would be proud of how you fought for our family," Robert told Madison as they planted the last of the new roses. "You saved us both, even when I was too manipulated to realize I needed saving." Madison had discovered strength she never knew she possessed. The shy graduate student who had been overwhelmed by household management had become a fierce protector of her family's legacy, someone willing to fight sophisticated criminals and win.
2 years after the FBI raid that changed everything, Madison Williams stood in the third-floor studio of her family home, but this time she wasn't alone. The space had been transformed into the headquarters of the Williams Foundation for Elder Protection, a nonprofit organization that had become her life's most meaningful work. The morning sun streamed through the same windows where she'd once painted therapeutic exercises for troubled teenagers, but now the easels held presentation boards displaying statistics about financial elder abuse, warning signs of manipulation, and resources for families in crisis. What had begun as Madison's personal nightmare had evolved into a mission that was protecting hundreds of other families across New England. "Madison, the Channel 8 news crew is here for your interview," called Jessica Harper, her foundation's program director and the first employee Madison had hired with the recovered funds from Veronica's offshore accounts. The irony wasn't lost on Madison that money stolen from victims was now funding efforts to prevent other families from suffering similar devastation. The federal court had awarded the Williams Foundation $1.2 million in recovered assets to establish educational programs and support services for elder abuse victims. As Madison prepared for the television interview, she reflected on how completely her life had changed. The shy art therapy graduate who had once felt overwhelmed by household bills was now a nationally recognized advocate who testified before congressional committees and consulted with law enforcement agencies across the country. The Foundation's main program, Safeguarding Legacies, provided free educational workshops for families about financial manipulation tactics. Madison had developed the curriculum based on her own experience, creating practical tools to help people recognize the warning signs she'd missed in her own family. "The most dangerous predators are the ones who seem most helpful," Madison explained to the camera during her interview. "They don't announce themselves as criminals. They position themselves as solutions to your problems, as people who care more than anyone else about your well-being." The Foundation had documented over 300 cases of suspected elder abuse in its first 18 months, helping families recover more than $8 million in stolen assets. More importantly, they'd prevented countless other schemes by educating families about manipulation techniques before criminals could establish control. Madison's personal transformation extended far beyond her professional advocacy work. The experience of fighting for her inheritance had taught her that ownership required active protection, that valuable things didn't preserve themselves simply because they were legally protected. Her relationship with her father had evolved into something deeper and more honest than it had ever been during her childhood. Robert, now fully recovered from the pharmaceutical manipulation that had clouded his judgment, had become Madison's closest collaborator in both the foundation work and the management of their family legacy. "I spent months being angry with myself for falling for Veronica's manipulation, but our therapist helped me understand that sophisticated criminals target specific vulnerabilities. Grief, loneliness, the desire to find meaning after loss, these aren't character flaws. They're human experiences that predators exploit." Robert had become one of the Foundation's most effective speakers, sharing his story at conferences and workshops despite the personal embarrassment involved. His willingness to admit vulnerability helped other victims overcome the shame that often prevented them from seeking help
or reporting crimes. The house on Maple Ridge Drive had been restored to honor Helen's memory while accommodating its new role as both family home and foundation headquarters. Madison had converted the former dining room into a conference space where support groups met weekly, providing a safe environment for families to share their experiences and learn from each other. The garden had been expanded to include a memorial section dedicated to victims of elder abuse who hadn't survived to see justice. Helen's original roses remained the centerpiece, but new plantings created spaces for reflection and healing that served both the family and the community they now supported. Madison's art therapy practice had evolved to focus specifically on trauma recovery for abuse victims and their families. She developed innovative techniques combining traditional therapy with creative expression, helping people process the complex emotions involved in betrayal by trusted individuals. Her client base now included people from across the country who traveled to work with someone who truly understood the psychological aftermath of systematic manipulation. Madison's approach was unique because she combined professional training with personal experience, offering insights that purely academic therapists couldn't provide.
The hardest part isn't the financial loss, Madison often told her clients. It's learning to trust your own judgment again after someone has systematically convinced you that your perceptions were wrong. The Foundation's research had revealed disturbing trends in elder abuse that extended far beyond individual cases like Veronica and Marcus. They'd identified networks of criminals who shared information about successful manipulation techniques, training materials that taught psychological exploitation, and even referral systems that connected criminals with potential targets. This isn't random crime, Madison explained during her congressional testimony. It's organized criminal enterprise with sophisticated methods and substantial profits. We need federal resources dedicated to investigating and prosecuting these networks. Her advocacy had contributed to new legislation requiring enhanced background checks for individuals seeking power of attorney, mandatory training for professionals who work with elderly clients, and improved coordination between state and federal agencies investigating financial elder abuse. Madison's personal life had also flourished in ways she never could have anticipated during the darkest days of her struggle with Veronica. She had met David Chen, the private investigator who had helped expose the criminal conspiracy during the Foundation's planning stages. Their relationship had developed slowly, built on shared commitment to justice and mutual respect for each other's strength. "I never thought I'd date someone I met during a criminal investigation," Madison laughed when friends asked about their unusual origin story. But David understood what I'd been through in ways that someone without that experience never could. Their engagement had been announced at the Foundation's second annual gala, a celebration that brought together law enforcement officials, advocacy organizations, and families who had benefited from the Foundation's services. The wedding was planned for the following spring, to be held in the garden where Madison had once fought to preserve her mother's roses. The financial security that came with recovering her inheritance had given Madison freedom to pursue meaningful work without worrying about basic survival. But more importantly, the experience had taught her that security came not from passive ownership, but from active engagement with protecting what mattered most. Madison had established a college scholarship program for students pursuing careers in elder advocacy, social work, and criminal justice. The first recipients were beginning their studies with full funding and internship opportunities at organizations fighting financial abuse. "My mother left me more than just a house," Madison reflected during her remarks at the scholarship award ceremony. "She left me the responsibility to use whatever advantages I inherited to protect other families. That's what legacy really means, not just preserving what you've received, but building something that serves others." The Williams Foundation had expanded beyond Connecticut, establishing partnerships with similar organizations in 12 states and consulting with law enforcement agencies internationally. Madison's expertise was now sought by prosecutors handling complex elder abuse cases and by legislators crafting protective policies. The Foundation's victim support program had helped over 800 families navigate the complex process of reporting financial abuse and recovering stolen assets.
More than half of these cases resulted in criminal prosecutions, and the average recovery rate was 67% of stolen funds. Unprecedented success in a field where most victims traditionally lost everything. As Madison stood in her transformed studio on this bright morning, she could see her mother's garden through the windows, but now it was filled with people attending the foundation's weekly support group meeting. Survivors of financial abuse sat in circles among Helen's roses, sharing their stories and supporting each other's healing. The girl who had once felt powerless watching her inheritance slip away had become a woman who protected inheritance rights for hundreds of other families. The daughter, who had nearly lost her relationship with her father, had created a model for how families could rebuild trust after surviving manipulation together. Madison Williams had learned that the most valuable inheritance wasn't the money or property her mother had left her. It was the strength to fight for justice, the compassion to help others through similar struggles, and the wisdom to understand that true security came from building something larger than herself. The nightmare that had once threatened to destroy her family had been transformed into a foundation for protecting countless others. And in that transformation, Madison had discovered not just who she was, but who she was meant to become.
Up next, you've got 2 more standout stories right on your screen. If this one hits the mark, you won't want to pass these up. Just click and check them out. And don't forget to like, subscribe, and turn on the notification bell so you don't miss any upload from us.